Hey class, my name is Craig Yarboro, and Pat has asked me to come in this evening and speak with you for a few hours tonight about what happens after you go under contract. What we need to remember though is that we've already talked about the offer to purchase. You've already done the offer to purchase, you're under contract, and now we're moving forward to the other. We've talked about the basics of the contract law. Those are things you've talked about previously before tonight. You've already talked about how to complete the offer to purchase. You've gone into detail about all of the line items, everything that has to be done on the offer in order to make it a contract, and you're finished. And we've also explained all the parts of the offer to purchase and the addendum that are required to go into the contract. Remember that as real estate brokers, we are not allowed to make any contracts. We can't type anything, we cannot add anything. All we can do is take the pre-printed forms and we type in and we fill those forms out. Anything extra than that has to be done by an attorney. So what we're going to talk about tonight is we're going to pick up and we're going to talk about the closing preparations and procedures. So we're going to discuss the procedures that happen after you go under contract and before your client goes to the settlement table to sign all their loan documents. Anybody have any questions? Everybody good up to par? And any questions about what has happened in the previous classes? None? Everybody's good. So Pat's done a good job up to me coming in, right? Okay. What we're going to talk about is the general issues. And tonight I actually brought a pamphlet that I'm going to pass out. I'm going to give it to Matt and ask Matt if he'll take one and pass it around. And we're going to discuss this brochure. This is a brochure that's printed by the Real Estate Commission, and it explains a lot about the procedures and different things that go on. And so we're going to discuss this. And I'm going to ask some questions, and y'all begin to answer. Y'all tell me what you think everything goes on with this. Does a loan commitment letter guarantee that I have a loan to buy the property? No. Why?
You haven't signed anything, right? I mean, nothing's been given to you at that point.
Okay. Think about it though. You've already been to see a lender, correct? Before you ever wrote an offer, before you start looking at houses, your client has already been to see a lender to get qualified. So they've got the qualification letter because you had to have that when you presented your offer. Now, just because you have that, does that mean that you're guaranteed your loan?
No.
No, it does not. Many things can happen during that loan process. Sometimes they go in and all you've done is preliminary search. They've taken the information that you have given them and they have looked it up and they say, based on this information, you're good to get a loan. And so they give you a loan commitment letter that you can move forward with in purchasing a home. But at that point, they haven't researched and verified all your income. They haven't gotten all your tax information. They haven't gotten a lot of information that has to be given to them before it goes to underwriting and gets the loan completed for your client. So these are things that you need to be aware of when you begin this process, is that anything can hold up this process.
Craig,
Yes.
I'm sorry, just have a quick question. If we're under contract and we have a loan commitment, would it be advisable to advise our clients not to, go out and buy a new Mercedes or go on an expensive trip or anything that could trigger some additional financial obligations that could put that loan commitment in jeopardy?
That is really a good question, Matt. Did y'all hear what Matt asked? Basically what he's saying is that you've got a loan commitment letter. Your client has been approved, has purchased a home, you're under contract. During this time, is it good for them to go out and make any other purchases? He said a Mercedes. Typically, what are most of our clients going out and doing once they put a house under contract? Buying furniture. And so yes, you should have a conversation with your client that once they have gotten an approval, a pre-approval from their lender, is don't make any additional purchases. Do not do anything that can change their credit scores. Because going out and getting furniture and applying for a loan, that can reduce their credit scores. And so you need to advise them, do not do anything to make this change. And you'd be amazed, a lot of people go out and apply for credit, but they don't make a purchase. Because they think they need to wait till after the closing to go out and actually make the purchase. The credit is what affects their credit score. If a furniture company gives you credit for $2,000, $3,000 to buy furniture, that's gonna show up as a credit, as a deficit on your credit report. So make sure you advise them not to do anything that can affect their credit. Thank you, Matt. What kind of inspections do I really need to have to find out about the condition of the property?
You can have a termite inspection.
A termite inspection is one of the first ones that we typically are going to do.
Survey?
Surveys are good to do, and everybody, all lenders now do not require surveys. Because most of our subdivisions now are platted out and they have lines drawn, so they don't require surveys. Are surveys still good to have? Absolutely. Because what does a survey show that you do not know any other way? Encroachments. A fence, a garage that I remember we have discussed before is the fact that somebody, your neighbor, you could have encroached into their property not even realizing it because their fence is in their property and you've gone close to the fence. So any of these things can show up in a survey.
Correct.
Yes?
When you have the survey done as a buyer, will it show such things as like easements, or is that something you're gonna have to, like, go, well, only if you see records of that? Will a survey pick something like that up?
That's a good question, Jason. Did y'all hear what Jason asked? What Jason's asking is that if you do a survey, is it going to show all of the easements on the property or any other than just the property lines? And actually, a survey that you do for a closing like this does show easements. It'll show your easements, it'll show encroachment, it shows your property lines, it'll also show the residence, where the house is, if there are any outbuildings. All that shows up on a residential survey that we're looking for. And actually, I had a case where that showed up where in the neighborhood I'm at, and I'm in an older neighborhood, and we had a survey done, and my neighbor actually had a survey done. And he said the easements were on my property, which didn't faze me because there's no fence separating the two properties. But as it turned out, the easements were on his property. And so they were not on mine, and he didn't even realize that they were actually running down the side of his property. So, but yes, you do need to, surveys do show easements, and they're good to have, no matter what type of subdivision you're in. What other type of inspections would you do?
Inspection.
Home inspections we talked about. Appraisals, that's actually classified in inspection. And the lender will order that as soon as she gets all the paperwork and everything that she can get from you or he can get from you or your client. Because what happens is that they get the paperwork and then they review it to make sure that they have all the information they need and they send it to underwriting. Once that package goes to underwriting and they can disclose it to your buyer and they sign a disclosure, they can order a survey or order your home inspection. And I keep saying home inspection, they'll order your appraisal. An appraisal cannot be ordered immediately. There's paperwork documentation that has to be given to your lender in order for them to order the appraisal. Because the appraisal has to be paid for up front. Your buyers, as you're aware, usually pay for the appraisal as soon as they order it. And what happens is when your client goes in and sits with the lender, they're going to get their credit card information and they're going to have it on file. And then when they order the appraisal, they go ahead and charge the client's credit card. And that can range anywhere from $400 to $500 around based on the size of the property and where it's located. And so you want to make sure they're pretty comfortable in moving forward with a loan before they order a survey and or your appraisal. The other thing to keep in mind is what does an appraisal, when an appraiser, whenever they go out, that appraiser, when they go out and view the property, they're making notes on their appraisal, and that if there is some issues with the house that might prevent the lender from wanting to loan money, they note it, and they make it a subject to. on the appraisal, and that those items have to be addressed before they move forward. So these are things you want to make sure you have the home inspection done, you have all these things done, so that when the appraiser goes out, they're not having to deal with a lot of this stuff.
When you're saying address, does that mean they have to be fixed, or they just have to be noted in the contract that they're there?
Did y'all hear what Tracy was asking? She's saying if you address them in the appraisal, do they have to be corrected or just addressed or noted? And it's all based on the loan. If an appraiser notes it on an appraisal, makes it a subject to, it has to be fixed. If they note it on there, they just noted some of these issues, but it is not anything that matters for the loan, they'll put it in a different section. So there are two ways they can note it. They can just say, we noted these things. They're not a big deal. If they say subject to, then they have to be fixed. Because that way, this appraisal is based on these items being fixed. And if they're not corrected, then the appraisal is not the value they assign. And the worst one for that, the one to keep in mind, is the one that we most deal with all the time, are VA appraisals. VA has certain criteria, FHA, USDA. Those three, the government loans, all have issues with certain things on appraisals. And so if they go out and they find rotten wood, if they find peeling paint, if they find any raw carpet, if it's exposed flooring, they're going to note that on the appraisal. Those things have to be corrected before you close on the loan. Other issues that we deal with are well and sewage disposal systems. I know that in previous classes, Pat has probably discussed the fact that you got to be careful on a house and make sure that if it is a septic system, that it has perk for the amount of bedrooms that the house is being advertised at or what they're showing. So you got to make sure that's done. On all VA loans now, all VA loans, if it has a septic system and a well, they're requiring an inspection. That has only happened this year. It used to be that if the house was vacant for over 3 months, that they did require septic inspections and well inspections to check the water and so forth, but now it's on all loans that are VA is required. Also, radon. How many of you ever thought that radon was an issue here? Because of some basements, yes. Most often, we've always thought of radon being in areas where there's hills, the mountain areas, in Raleigh area, different places. But radon has become very prominent even on our coast. And so now it is worth getting a radon test for your client to know that it is safe in that house. And there's several different ways you can do it. You can buy a kit at Home Depot, Loans. You can order an inspector. They come in from Raleigh and they'll inspect it. It takes a few days to set up and they do this. But you should never ever recommend to a client that they do not get a radon inspection. Because if anybody ever ends up with radon gas and they come back and say, well, my broker told me it wasn't necessary to get, you do not want to ever be put in that position. So make sure you've always allowed them the opportunity to get radon inspections. What is title insurance? Guesses?
Title search, check for clouds on the title.
The attorney's going to do a title search. And what happens is the fact that he has gone back and he's researched title at least 30 years, usually further back than 30, as far back as he can go. And he's going to issue a title letter, a clear title, that he fills out paperwork and issues his history, and he submits it to the title insurance company, and they will write a policy. Any other questions about title insurance? Who does it protect? The lender, and the buyer, the owner, whoever is buying, the future owner. It also protects the owner of the property. But remember, the owner of the property who is selling the property to your client is taking responsibility and saying, I have clear title and I can sell the property. So it's protecting them because they're saying when they transfer title that they've given the buyer clear title to the house. so it protects them. And there are two title policies. There's one for the lender and there's one for the buyer. So that based on the apportionment of who puts what down, but the lender's portion will gradually go down through the years for the amount of money, and the buyer's amount goes up based on where the house is or as far as there are any issues. What if the seller wants to give me a non-warranty or a quit-claim deed? They'll be accepting it as is. Is it something that you would advise your clients to do? No. What deed is it that you want your client to have? A general warranty deed. And that you discussed in detail in pre-licensing. And which other one is the other one that we're going to get typically in our area? A special warranty deed, which is typically issued through the banks and foreclosures. Which means that all they did was go back to the history of the time that they had lent money on the property. They do not go back and do a full search. A quit-claim deed, is that giving you any warranties? No. All it is releasing that person from their share of their property, that area of the house, right? But it does not free them up from any mortgage issues.
If you got a quick claim deed on a piece of property, you decided to take the risk and take it, can you work with an attorney to try to get it under a special warranty deed?
An attorney's typically not going to do a special warranty deed. They're going to do a full search and do a general warranty deed.
Okay.
But a quitclaim deed is not used really to transfer property
Okay.
into somebody else's name. That quitclaim deed is used to clear a cloud on the title
Okay.
so that you can move forward and get a special warranty deed, a general warranty deed. What is homeowners associations? Everybody familiar with a homeowner association? How many of you live in a homeowners association? And so you're pretty familiar with the fact that some of them are very strict and some of them are not. What's one of the most important things that we need to remember as a broker dealing with people that are buying in an HOA?
But you make sure they're informed about it.
You disclose it, they know about it, and that we make sure that we give them copies or make available to them copies of all the covenants and restrictions. Is it your responsibility to explain the covenants and restrictions? No. Please do not ever advise your client about what they mean with it in the HOA if they do not understand something that's written in there. If they have a question, they can either go to their attorney who's closing for them, or they can go to the HOA and ask the question for as far as, what does this mean? But please do not, as a broker, ever get into that situation and say, well, this is what it means, and you can get by with this. They really don't care. Because that can only come back to bite us as a broker if you ever do that. So be careful. It is not your responsibility to explain the covenants and restrictions, just to make them available to your client. What happened if the property is damaged or destroyed after I sign the purchase contract but before closing? Okay, did you hear what Tracy said? That the seller is responsible for fixing it, making it correct? It's actually the contract. If you remember in our offer to purchasing contract, it actually stipulates that the property is to be in as good as or better condition than when they wrote the offer on the property. So in essence, yes, the seller should correct it. But in the final decision making, whose right is it to either move forward or not?
Buyer.
The buyer. All we do is we do a walkthrough with the buyer. We let them know what's in there and what that, if there's anything that's missing that's supposed to be there, if there's any other damage, whatever, but it's up to the buyer to make a decision whether or not they're gonna move forward with it, or whether or not they wanna stop at this point and go back and make sure that it's corrected. It is not our decision to do that. Who closes the transaction?
Attorney.
In North Carolina, we are typically an attorney state. Attorneys do all the title work, they do the closings, we go to settlement in the attorney's office. But there are instances now that we do have some title companies that are doing closings. And typically they may have, yes.
I'm curious what closing attorneys charge. Is there a big variance, or is it something pretty standard?
Again, attorneys are kind of like brokerages. We do not preset and determine commissions, nor can attorneys stipulate this is what we're going to charge across the board. Every attorney can set their own price.
And they're paid at closing too?
And they are paid at closing through the buyer's closing, they pay for it. But it is determined by each individual attorney and what they feel like that their services are valued at. I can tell you that in our area, there are attorneys that charge as low as $450, and there are attorneys that charge $1,200. The typical closing fee is between $925 and $975. I cannot tell you the differences in the attorneys, because I don't know. I use certain attorneys, and usually, can you choose your client's attorney?
The seller chooses the attorney?
No, your buyer.
The buyer does?
Do you choose the attorney for the buyer?
No, you speaking as a broker?
Correct. Did you hear Mary? Mary said you can make recommendations. Usually, there may be some attorneys that you have relationships with, and that they will help you fit into schedules. And there's nothing wrong with you offering your client 2 or 3 names of attorneys and let them decide which attorney. But typically, it's not up to you to say, well, this is the attorney I'm using, this is who I'm gonna go with. Always make sure that you give your buyer an opportunity to choose. Typically, I always make attorneys, names available to all my buyers and sellers, because the seller has to have an attorney too, correct? Because they're deed prep and representation. Who are most attorneys representing in a transaction? The buyer. So your buyer is choosing an attorney to represent them at closing. But in most cases, and I won't say all cases, but in most cases, the seller typically is going to say, just let the buyer's attorney do their deed prep. So they don't have to go looking for a different attorney to do it. But then who is the attorney representing? It is typically they tell the seller, I'm representing the buyer. I will represent you and do the deed under a limited relationship. So basically their relationship is limited to anything dealing with the deed preparation. And that is all that they're representing them on. And most sellers are okay with that. I typically do not use the same attorney for both. And it's not that there's a conflict with by any means, but I usually find that I do not want my buyer's attorney to be working in any form for the seller. Now, that is a decision that I recommend to my buyers, just to say, this is who, and I let the buyer's attorney know if they make that decision, that if they're asked by the seller to do it, that you've been asked by the buyer not to do their deed prep. Now, I can't get into ramifications and stuff. All I do is tell the buyer that there is always a limited responsibility that the closing attorney has to a seller if they do the deed prep, and that it's usually you want your own attorney, so if there's ever an issue that arises, that you have representation, and if there's an issue with them, they have representation. But it's up to the buyers and the sellers to decide which course that they choose to go in that. In my contract, the seller agreed to pay $2,000 in closing costs. What costs are included?
Title search.
All of those. Also, any type of inspections that you do that were not prepaid. You've got to do insurance, all of your flood certifications. Any of that stuff goes into the cost, the closing costs. So most closing costs are going to go beyond $2,000. But if they agreed to pay $2,000, in the old days with the HUD, before we switched over to the closing disclosure, it used to be they itemized, and they put the sellers paying these items a total of $2,000, and then everything else went under the buyer column. Now, because the closing disclosures are different, quite frankly, a lot of times what you see on the closing disclosure is just a dollar number that said, here, we're giving you this number of dollars, and they don't itemize it. Just recently, there was a decision made that now we as brokers on the buy side, that we can actually see the closing disclosures on the seller side to make sure that all of the items that we needed paid are on there. It used to be that we saw that all the time with the HUD, but then after they switched over with Frank Dodd, is they couldn't do that anymore. So we only saw the side that we represented. And now we can actually see it. We're not allowed to disclose it to the buyer or to the seller. We see it and we can go through and make sure that everything is on there, to make sure that it has been listed, especially the fact that, let's say that you're representing the seller and you've agreed to pay $4,500 of the buyer's closing costs. And they just give the buyer $4,500 on their closing disclosure, and yet they take all the closing costs. One of those closing costs only total $4,200. And they've actually given the buyer $300 that exceed their closing. Whose responsibility is that to verify? The seller's agent should review that whenever they're looking at the closing disclosure. They should add those up and say, hey, closing costs did not go to $4,500, so that $300 can come back over to their client. It's also our responsibility. Remember, we're all brokers, and we have a fiduciary duty to the buyer, but we also have a duty to the seller. And remember, you're creating a form of loan fraud if you actually allow a buyer to get credit for money that they're actually not using. So you need to make sure that the total number of figures add up and that that's what they're getting credit for on the buy side.
Is it common for the seller to help pay closing costs?
Did you hear what Katie said? It's actually a good question because in our area, I would say it's about 60-40 yes. And it's not that they have to. I would just say that in most cases here, that most buyer's agents ask sellers to pay closing costs or a portion of, so that it reduces the amount of money that the buyers have to bring to closing. So
My sellers paid our whole closing costs, but I didn't know if that was weird, but they.
it is not weird. I ask for it on every one of mine. Every buyer I have, I always ask that the sellers pay 3% of their closing costs. And most lenders will allow 3%, especially on conventional. Sometimes there's a 4%, in some cases there's no max at all from the government stuff. And I think VA, they allow 4%, and I have to verify that number, but there are certain restrictions in all cases. But with VA loans, it is also a requirement that the seller pay the pest inspection. So whether or not there is a bond on the property, whether you're in an HOA where there's a bond on the property, it is required that you order a pest inspection on a VA loan, because it has to come in the buyer's name, that the inspection was done, and that the house is clear. And that inspection has to be paid for by the seller, even if they're not paying closing costs. Any other questions? Now, let's ask, what is a closing disclosure? You've seen them. You've had a couple of closings by now.
That shows all the funds.
A closing disclosure is what is disclosed to a buyer, and the buyer actually takes a list of the property value, what the purchase price is, and then it itemizes all of the expenses up to that point, or as far as what is expected for them to pay. And then it totals that number, and then what it does underneath it, midway down, it gives you their credits for if their closing costs are being paid, their loan value, prorations on taxes, etc. is listed on there. It gives them, and then you add that and gives you a total for what their credit is. And then you subtract that from the total, and it tells you whether or not they're getting cash back at closing, or whether or not they have to bring money to closing. Cash back at closing, they're only allowed to get back how much money they put into it. So if they prepaid their home or their appraisal, if they put down $1,000, $1,500 in earnest money, whatever they put into it, due diligence money, those figures are added in there, and they're allowed to get that much money back at closing. They cannot get anything more back than what they have put into the loan. But in most cases here, I would say that the majority of our sellers pay a portion of or all closing costs. Now, there are two different types of closing disclosures. There's a buyer and a seller. Up until Frank died, there were one, and it was the HUD. And it disclosed the buyers and the seller side, so everybody saw it. But then because of privacy issues that came up, is that now they do two closing disclosures, one for the buyer and one for the seller. So we don't see each other's side. Y'all have any questions concerning closing disclosures? You understand the two of them? What is prorating?
Like with their taxes, if you buy a house, you prorate the tax.
Did you hear Katie? It is a lot of proration of taxes. That's the number one, usually prorated. And usually what they do is you're paying, the seller is going to pay from January 1 through the day of closing. They own the property the day of closing, so they're going to pay through that day. And they're going to give you a credit on the buy side. And then when the tax bill comes out in August, yes, in August, the tax bill comes